pleasure to introduce David in a few seconds. But I really hope that for all of you, this morning, Wednesday morning of the GapSummit will be memorable, because I just feel I'm impressed by Kieran's very nice story. I see this picture of her as a 25-year-old, and I wrote down this quote: "Nothing should stop you if you believe in it." And I hope we'd look at it from her entrepreneurial story, but also from leading large institutions and how in that setting you can be an entrepreneur and a leader. Mm-hmm. So that's perhaps the theme here. And we jointly have the opportunity to interview David. Now let me turn to David Pyott. It's my honor and pleasure actually to introduce you. As promised, I keep that super short, and David will add to that. Because just a few facts that impressed me. Number one is what he's doing today. He's a professional director on a number of boards. He's a private investor and philanthropist. So that's an amazing in itself. So there was a distinguished CEO and chairman career at Allergan for 17 years, and he was rated by the Harvard Business Review as number 4 as among the best performing CEOs. And what maybe not so many know, there was actually a 70-year career before leading Novartis Nutrition. And then there are a lot of recognitions along the way. And what I found for you may be more interesting, he lived in 10 countries. He operated in 7 languages, speaks a few of them. So he's a true global leader. So if that's not amazing enough, I don't know what we can do here. So I hope for you that we jointly have a lot of questions for David. How we'll run it, I will kick it off with a couple of questions, and then you have the chance to pile on. Now, turning to you, David. How did you actually become CEO after all? Was that your life goal when you started as a youngster and say, I will become CEO? Or how did that work?
No, I think just like, I think I'll make a lot of bridges to what I learned, because I, of course, know Kieran from various venues over time, but some very important themes that we'll come back on. And I think, when you start out, if you really believe that you're going to be a big company CEO, I'd say you probably have an attitude adjustment problem right there, right? Because, there's what I call fake CEOs, people who say, I'm CEO, and I have 4 employees. Well, yeah, sure, it's CEO, but that's slightly different than having 10,000 employees. So you just have to be careful, what quadrant you're thinking in. I think what I would say is always see to the next vista, the next horizon, tackle that. Above all, make sure you're having some fun, as well as working really hard. Because if you're going to work whatever it is, 40, 60, 70 hours a week, I feel really sorry for you if, you look back on the prior 10 years and say that was nothing but a grind. I got no gratification, no satisfaction. That would be pretty sad. I think what we also heard several times is that I think the blind pursuit of money is really a false god in any culture. Hopefully one day you'll be very good at what you do and money will find its way. But, once you have a reasonable amount of money, just having twice the amount of money actually does nothing. It doesn't make you any happier. It doesn't make you any greater self-satisfaction. Maybe there'll be people out there that are impressed that you're in some list somewhere, but who cares, right? You've got to be absolutely convinced that what you're doing is really important, whatever that importance is for you as a person. So I think those are the kinds of messages I would give.
Great. We had yesterday a discussion with some of you in the workshops, and we had this dialogue. Are you clear on your purpose and your core? And I think you are very strongly supporting that, David. After 10 years, you have to ask yourself, what did you actually achieve, and what you believe in. Yeah. Now, can you tell us maybe a little bit like reflection on your career as you went into this situation? You told me also a little bit you made some shift because you left some things you didn't like on the way. How did that work? Was it your gut feel? How did your career evolve?
Yeah. So when Matthias and I were speaking, I thought it's far more interesting for you to talk about the beginning versus the end, because if you're successful along the way, all these various sort of fun recognitions will come raining down on you. And I like to joke, it sort of seems to correlate with advancing age as well. When you get all these gongs and rewards and scrolls and hats and whatever, you know, your culture of recognition is. So the beginning is much more important. And I think, you know, in my case, you know, I worked for various banks initially until finally, you know, maybe my concrete wall was my head on the wall, kind of going, actually, I really don't like banking at all, you know, which then leads you to like, why in the heck am I doing this? And for me then, you know, to go back and do an MBA and do a kind of a complete sort of professional shift was very important. I think in all of this too, I think the ability to continually develop skills of, you know, how do you interact with others, really, really important. I think a message I'd give you is, and we got a bit into this yesterday in one of the discussions, you know, should you, you know, do a PhD, then found a company? And I think several people said, you know, get your PhD, publish, because then if you're in a science realm, you have credibility for everybody, you know, especially those that are writing the checks or bringing you the, you know, the basket of cash to get you started. So I think my sort of message is, whatever your area of expertise is, be darn good at it. And as part of that, sometimes you need sort of formal diplomas, titles, etc., which is the way society tries to weed out, you know, who is really good and who is just average. And, you know, clearly talking to you all around the various breaks, you're all, you know, several echelons above average, but people all the time will be checking on you to make sure that's the case. So I think, you know, reiterating, go back and find what's your true north, if you like, what you'd really like to get deep into. And if you haven't found it yet, keep experimenting. Obviously, you can't experiment forever. You know, otherwise, you know, you'll be a doctoral student when you're 45, and that kind of doesn't work either, right? You all know that from your institutions and careers.
Oh, great, David. So what I hear is, I mean, you are not shying away, or you are also suggesting, find your north and your purpose, and don't shy away from career choices. So you made a choice after banking. I mean, if you look at it, you had a very long, successful career in very different areas, in pharmaceuticals and nutrition, and then pharmaceuticals. So don't shy away from that. You talked about, okay, you need to be good in something, I mean, to start with. Now, if I look at over your career, you led Novartis Nutrition. I mean, I didn't mention so much at Allergan. You transformed the company through various chapters. You launched the perhaps highest demand product, one of the highest demand products, which is Botox. So very different leadership challenges. So I would like to dive a little bit into what type of competencies or capabilities do you feel were important, and how did you pick them up over time?
Yeah. So if I sort of start with, say, you know, the first sort of important post-MBA chapter, that was kind of a really important decision, you know, to take a year and a half out and go back to university and make sure that I learned the hard skills that I felt that I was missing. And, you know, I said to several people yesterday in one of the workshops that we did, or I attended, you know, for scientists, I would go back and say, if you feel uncomfortable about accounting and finance, go and do a short course so that you never feel uncomfortable ever again. It is not difficult. Believe me, for me as a non-scientist, I have a much greater problem trying to come your way. So go and do, whether it's an EMBA, executive MBA, or some finance course. This doesn't take that long, and with your intelligence levels and drive, dead simple. So I think then I would go back and say, okay, I did my MBA. I became, you know, typical of lots of people, you know, the head of strategy of a division, and that happened to be Sandoz at the time before it became Novartis. And so I was the, if you like, the personal assistant, head of strategy, a little bit of, you know, the personal troubleshooter for the boss. Happily for me, and I never imagined it, you know, 13 years later, I was the boss. Now, of course, you don't suddenly, you know, go from this chair to that chair so quickly. And in my case, you know, I literally climbed the rungs market by market, getting bigger and bigger. So much to some people's surprise, I turned down my first non-headquarters job in Canada to go to Malaysia and Singapore in a time where, you know, those countries weren't really regarded as the future in the slightest. And so a lot of people thought that, you know, I was just slightly off. You know, I was making a grave mistake. Luckily, you know, expanded the business very rapidly by solving a strategic problem. And then I kind of joked with my Swiss colleagues that I was then transferred to the Eastern Front because I was sent to Vienna, which is actually a wonderful place to be. And, you know, at the age of 33, I was the general manager of Austria. And of course, at the beginning, some of the Austrians, you know, said, I could hear behind my back, like, what did we do to deserve a Scotsman from the bush? Now, the good news is I already spoke fluent German, so I was able to get over, you know, the rejection thing pretty quickly. Fortunately, that all worked out really well, and my delusions of staying there for many years, because I liked it, were shattered. And then I was moved to Spain, so I called that my Latino phase. I was forced to learn Spanish in about 3 months. I was fluent within 6 because I made it my business to be. And in this learning, of course, I'm getting into the soft skill part. You know, how do you find a way to interact with your colleagues, first of all, because you have to have them with you, but then your customers. And in all of this, of course, I would say to you, always have your ears very wide open. And if you're the observer from the outside, you can learn a lot. Most people make the mistake of, you know, they talk far too much about themselves and their own goals. Now, clearly, you need to provide a context, but after that is, how do we work together? How do I help you fulfill your goal? And in all of this, you can imagine at the beginning, you know, I was a bit of a control freak. We heard this from some of the other speakers. I like to check up on stuff. And then as you go through the gears of, you know, from 50 employees to 200 to, you know, when I was then transferred to the US, you know, I then had a couple of thousand. And then when I was the head of the division, you know, I had 11,000 employees. If you can't delegate, you've got one heck of a problem, right? So then the next piece of advice in all of this is not only learning all these soft skills of how do you find out really what's going on, how do you motivate people, how do you make them fiercely loyal, not to you blindly, but the mission of the enterprise. Those are all very, very important and very powerful concepts. I think something we'll bridge back to, but I'll let Matthias ask the next question, is all the way along this journey, I felt very much like an entrepreneur. So I was very fortunate. I didn't have the problems that Kieran spoke of. I had access to enormous amounts of capital. The question was, were the people in that first career, the Swiss, going to give me enough of that capital to hopefully not break my neck and produce a great result? And fortunately, every time they gave me some money, they could see the return. So guess what? You just get more and more and more. And then suddenly you're the boss, right, of a division, admittedly. So you can see how this all links together.
I mean, it's interesting, David, how much you emphasize the soft skills, the interaction with the people, the listening, be it the customer, be it the colleague. And reading an interview about you, I was also impressed how at the Allergan times you talked about building your complementary team. I don't know if you maybe have 2-3 more words about how to build a team.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think whether you're, you know, you've realized your dream, right? You've maybe done your PhD, you've found some seed capital, you set up your first enterprise. I think so important is to try and really rationally for yourself decide, what am I really good at? And especially, what don't I know about? And of course, we heard that several times from various speakers. Good leaders are the first to admit what they don't know. And, you know, to be able to attract those people to work for you who bring the skills that you don't have. Now, as a small fledgling enterprise, and even later on, maybe you can't have everybody, so to speak, strictly on the payroll for the advice and counsel you need. And that's where you need a network of outside people, whether they're just somebody you've known from along the way. Mentors we're going to come back to, very, very important. People that you can learn from on the way up. In my case, I had some great mentors who never had a mentorship role. At that time, I can tell you, in a Germanic type organization, the word mentorship didn't exist. It was like, you haven't broken your neck this year, well done. But you can certainly learn a lot from people's behavior and the way they treat you. Back to this ring of advisors, it could be a professor, it could be a friend, it could be somebody in the same industry who's just willing to lend a helping hand because they see themselves when they're younger, maybe. Sometimes, of course, you might even want to go and hire McKinsey if you're coming along at a certain point where you could afford this service because it's so important. So always be checking, what don't I know? What are my points of strength? And if I have a weakness, how do I shore it up in a way that will lead to a greater probability of success?
I know I promised you we would jointly interview David, so I can't stop myself. I have 2 more questions, but I assume you have some ready for him as well. Mm-hmm. Because you talked about the journey, let's briefly also talk about actually being a CEO. What does life as a CEO actually look like? Because you mentioned already it's also being entrepreneurial, and it's not only managing a large organization.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, if your goal is to be CEO, I would say the enjoyment lasts for probably a couple of days. You have this, nice big title, it's whatever in your culture, whether it's, insignia on your hat or here, that's all cool. But then it's like, okay, what have you done for me recently? No matter who your investor is, whether it's private sources of capital, they have a slightly longer cycle. If you're a public company CEO and you've screwed up the quarter, believe me, people will be screaming and you will not be their favorite person. So I think, the next point is, and I really, applaud Kieran and her story, and I could tell you, and I will, a few remarks about the Allergan story. There are lots of different kind of chapters, and being CEO and being fulfilled and successful and having great employees is a journey that just goes on and on and on. And, if I think back to Allergan, the initial issues I had when I was hired as only the 3rd CEO in year 49, which is very unusual in any culture, let alone an American culture and, high kind of revolution, high change, California. So I had $1 billion in revenue. By the time I finished 17 years later, it was $7 billion in revenue. And almost all of that was organic. And so you can say, when I look back on my career, I probably had 4 different CEO jobs during that period. Although if you'd looked at my business card, you'd have said it was exactly the same one. It was completely different things. And of course, issues that I was all over at the beginning, I didn't even spend 2 days a year on later on because I had this great colleague where I could say, Jim or Joan, will you just take care of that for me? And if you have issues, you know where to find me, and otherwise just get it done. And then I was on to the next thing. And that was we were on to the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And the scale got bigger and bigger, even though I was fiercely protective of our really entrepreneurial culture that we'd built and were retaining. So people used to sort of laugh at me after a while. They said, you could maybe just about get away with saying Allergan's a small company at $2 billion in revenue, and I was pounding the table to say at $7 billion we're a small company. But I said it's here, right? Big ideas, but act as if we're small, flexible, nimble, listening to our customers. And frankly, I loved competing against Big Pharma because they were about 20 times slower than we were. And while they were still kind of checking their watch and having breakfast, we were cleaning up with invoices, right? So that was our strategic kind of thrust.
Okay, I think the passion comes through, and also how, I mean, that this is not a boring job. I think that clearly comes through. But hey, let's invite to widen the circle a little bit for questions.
Hi, I'm Cici from Singapore. I'm a nucleic acid chemist. So I'm very interested. It has been a remarkable story from Alnylam that last year that you got approval for the first RNAi drug. So I guess my question is that people have lots of doubt about RNAi therapy for a long time. So that's why it took about over a decade to bring it to get the approval. So how did you manage people's expectation, particularly from the investors and also from your company internally? How did you manage convince the employees believe the value of the therapy? And also it comes up to the next question that how people have been talking about the cell therapeutics a lot. Then how do you see small molecules and also like RNA oligonucleotides therapeutics in this?
So this is a question about a board that I serve on, which is very difficult to pronounce company. Alnilam is the name, and it's in the other Cambridge, i.e. Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I enjoy, as a board member, sometimes teasing them that seen from a Californian point of view, you know, Massachusetts is halfway back to Europe in terms of sometimes their attitudes to risk and getting stuff done. But now coming back to, you know, the story of Alnilam, where in fact we still haven't got our first product approved, but you know, God and FDA willing, the PDUFA date's coming up really soon, you know, before summer in Massachusetts. And you know, this is a story of a company with breakthrough technology, really from a Nobel Prize winner, if you go all the way back to the beginning. And you know, by the time we get our first product on the market, it will be 13 years, which really goes to, you know, Kieran's story in a way, maybe even more complicated, because this is kind of a beginning of a new era of how do you use this technology, initially for rare diseases, but you can go on and on as we, you know, refine it. So I think, you know, when I work with that company and I see the management and the employees, there's a huge excitement. And, you know, the company, that's the US. They've never made a profit. By the time we get to this summer, we'll have burned our way through about $2.4 billion of cash. The market capitalization, because it's the US, is, you know, call it roughly 12, 13 billion, which tells you there's huge expectations on the commercial sales, not just of that product, but product 2, product 3, product 4, product 5, most of which are fairly tangible, you know, where you can, you know what the product is good for. You've seen clinical data. You can do market modeling. You can do market share. And therefore, you can push in numbers into a model. You know, what will Alnylam be selling from product 1, 2, 3, 4 in the year 2024, and then do all the usual, you know, DCF type modeling that one would do. So I hope I gave you a sense of, you know, the way I see that company and why people work there is just passion for science and belief of changing patients' lives.
Thank you. Your story is very inspiring, and I want to specifically ask a question about Allergan and your story with Valiant. How do you preserve your business and technology amid market forces trying to maybe stop you or change your business? And how did you interact with investors and other people in your role as a CEO and a brave CEO?
Right. Well, I'll try and answer that in about 3 sentences, because first of all, the context is that we were kind of performing quite well. You know, call it sales progressing at about 10% plus. You heard from the numbers, and those of you can do math very fast. You know, compound annual sales growth over my period was 17% per annum. So then, you know, and profits were, you know, growing doubled, you know, call it mid-teens. So then along comes a hedge fund in alliance with Valiant, and basically using all sorts of interesting techniques, overnight become almost our largest, well, the largest shareholder and almost 10%. And so we knew we were in war then. And I didn't know the war was going to last for 7.5 months, but that's exactly what happened. And I think the greatest learnings there was above our prowess of having Botox, which is world-renowned, you know, for both aesthetic, but also more than half of it's therapeutic. We had the world's best portfolio in ophthalmology. Beyond the products, it was the culture that was really important. This was a company under massive attack. Literally, we could not keep out of the newspapers, off the media, more than about 1 day a week. We were in every newspaper in the world. The power of distraction was enormous. Under that fire, our best operating year in our corporate history was the year we were under attack. We actually grew revenue by $1 billion in that last year, which was, oddly enough, the number I inherited in year 49. Isn't that interesting? And the people, their passion to keep us independent and to keep these asset-stripping raiders away, because basically their plan was in 2 sentences. Strip the R&D by 90%, so take R&D from 1.1 billion down to about 150 million. And of course, we can all work that out. That has a huge effect on profitability, right? If you assume R&D is wasted or you don't need it. And the other one was tax stripping, because of until the US rules changed, they could instantly save 500 million in taxes. And in fact, I pointed out to Congress, the first bid premium was paid purely by the US taxpayer. It was disgusting. And they didn't get what they expected. They expected me to go to the negotiating table, and I basically gave them what's known in Scotland as the Glasgow kiss. If any of you know the Scots, we're pretty nice most of the time, but don't provoke us. And they had a huge fight on their hands, and I can say happily at the end, Valiant has crashed and burned. You know, it's a company that's now fighting for its own existence because the fraudulent kind of approach they had became exposed over time.
Yeah. Let's maybe try one more quick question.
Hi, Victoria from Sweden. Thanks so much for making time for this interesting session. My question is regarding you serving as a professional board member of 3 different companies with different culture, different strategies, values and goals.
Yeah.
So my question is, what is your personal strategy as a board member to separate between those 3 in terms of advice giving, decision making?
Right.
Thank you.
Well, I think first of all, probably, you know, being a board member is something that will be, you know, quite a long time away in your careers. And I think having a board member, I'll turn it the other way around, that you need in your companies, your organizations, are people who understand very well what their role is. Their job is not to manage the company. If that is the case, the CEO should be kicked out the next day, and probably several other members of that person's senior management team. So assuming you have the right and good, strong management in place, the job of the board is to really try and assist with thinking, you know, what is the best strategy for the company? And above all, I always say strategy is choosing what you don't want to do. That's the tough part, because people want to proliferate things all the time. The real advice I always give is focus on just a few things and do them really, really well. And make sure you're all the time thinking, what is that organization, the company, their inherent advantages? Why do customers buy stuff from them versus the other 2 or 3 that always exist? Or if there are what I call indirect markets, think very carefully, how do you influence those? So really the role of the board member is providing sound advice, strategy, but of course you can also be a mentor. And I often find in companies, people, some of the ones where I'm kind of regarded as one of the most knowledgeable board members because of the businesses I'd done in my past, i.e. pharma, large molecule, small molecule, medical devices or drugs delivered in devices and consumer, people will come to me, but I'd always say to them, I'm offer them advice, but I said, let me be really clear. Your CEO is the person that decides. So I'm just giving you some perspectives. But if you need to change something, please, for goodness sakes, he's the CEO, certainly not me. And that's the way I keep order.
Right.
So I hope that answered the question.
Right. David, I think at this point of time, we have to thank you.
Right,
I think you offered quite a number of valuable lessons. I mean, I took note of a few, like you talked about the purpose, what you really believe in, and even make tough choices on your way. I think find your north, be clear what you're good at, but I think also almost at least similar important, what you are not good at, build your team around you. And perhaps this lesson, you can grow into large leadership positions, but you still need to be an entrepreneur to be successful. And think in chapters. So hopefully that helps you for your new chapter. Let's thank David, the GapSummit team for setting us up. And to you.